Now let's dive into today's session. My name is Cristina Soto Quintero, and I'm the Curriculum and Evaluation Consultant at LDDI. With me today is my colleague Alison Lee, a learning designer, and Sarah Gong, learning designer as well. And together we'll be facilitating today's session. Our viewpoint is centered around this year's theme, which is intention, using technology mindfully and ethically in teaching and learning, guided by the ABCs of awareness, betterment, and care. Today, our focus is on how digital storytelling can cultivate empathy and inspire positive systemic change in education and community. We'll reflect together on how intention shapes storytelling, technology, and the work of imagining better futures for human and more than human worlds.
To begin the panel discussion, we would like to acknowledge that UBC and the servers that we are using for this virtual session are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I would also like to recognize the deep loss of the indigenous lands and the decrease in environmental health caused by colonization and further amplified by the emerging technologies like AI. May this acknowledgement inspire reflection and action toward reconciliation and environmental sustainability as we honor ongoing efforts to preserve and revitalize the planet. Okay, now let's introduce our four wonderful panelists that we have with us today. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Christina Kupulainen, a professor at the Department of Language and Literacy Education, Faculty of Education in the University of British Columbia. Her ongoing research examines children's ecological imagination, multimodal literacies, and more than human storytelling. She currently leads the Shirk Insight projects, enhancing ecological imagination through augmented storying, which engages children and communities in co-creating augmented stories with forests, animals, and everyday ecologies. Her work closely aligns with the ABCs of intention: awareness, betterment, and care, demonstrating how digital innovation can move beyond the market-driven logics to foster imagination, equity, and multi-species flourishing in the education and society.
We also have with us today Dr. Siobhan Wittig-McPhee. She's an associate professor of teaching in UBC's Department of Geography, specializing in innovative approaches to teaching and learning through digital tools, experiential learning, and place-based storytelling. Her work explores how immersive technologies, particularly spatial, sound, and augmented reality, can foster empathy and deepen understanding of social justice issues. Her recent projects include Spatial Empathy in Action, an immersive audio experience for grounding the voices of UBC's custodial staff, and the Vancouver Soundscapes Project, which transforms 5 decades of acoustic documentation into pedagogical tools. Dr. Wittig-McPhee has received numerous awards, including the AMS OER Champion Award 2025, and has secured over $300,000 in teaching and learning grants. Her research examines how digital storytelling can bridge academic knowledge with lived experiences, creating transformative learning opportunities that cultivate spatial empathy and advance the inclusion of historically marginalized communities.
We also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Maureen Kendrick, a professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. Her research examines literacy and multimodality as integrated communicative practices and addresses a range of social and cultural issues in diverse contexts. She has a particular interest in visual communication and communicative repertoires, and has conducted research in various geographic locations in East Africa and Canada, focused on women and girls, child-head households, and students with refugee experiences. Her current research focuses on understanding the potential of digital multimodal composing, including digital storytelling for disciplinary literacies for newcomer multilingual learners.
And we also have with us today Dr. Kathleen Deering. She's an associate professor in the Division of Social Medicine, Department of Medicine in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. She's also the faculty lead of the Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute Health Equity Research Hub and an associate member, Division of Occupational and Environmental Health, School of Population and Public Health at UBC. Her research program focuses on community-based research with people who have experienced social and structural violence, stigma and criminalization, including women living with HIV, sex workers, and people who use criminalized substances, understanding key aspects of trauma-informed practice with a focus on aligned peer-based approaches that can address and disrupt the impacts of trauma, violence, and stigma as health services barriers, investigating how structural policy and community interventions can address health and health services access inequities, and methodological issues in health equity research, including related to quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and arts-based methods. Please join me in welcoming them.
So in today's session, each panelist will share their viewpoints on cultivating empathy through digital storytelling. And we will then move into a moderated dialogue exploring opportunities, challenges, and ethical questions. Finally, we will open the floor for audience questions and discussions. Throughout the session, you are invited to post any comments or questions in the chat at any time. We will now invite each panelist to share their viewpoints on how empathy, digital storytelling, and intentional innovation come together in their work. With that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Kristiina Kupulainen to share a bit more about your work and perspective. Welcome, Dr. Kupulainen.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a privilege to join this highly important theme and session, Cultivating Empathy Through Digital Storytelling. In my own work, I am very interested in the possibilities digital technologies and media provide for enriching digital and storytelling in general. I have been interested in my research to investigate and research how this type of digital storytelling can cultivate empathy and care, particularly among young children in their communities, collaborating and interacting with children, educators, artists, and communities, and most importantly, interacting with the ecologies they are part of. I have been interested in how young children's stories, especially those ones that are digitally entangled, can become spaces for imagining and enacting more caring relationships among humans and the more than human world. I have a privilege to now lead an Insight Grant project that is named Enhancing Ecological Imagination Through Augmented Storying. I have been working with children, educators, artists, teachers, and young children, and with their local environments, both in Finland and Canada, and exploring how these types of augmented storying can invite children to co-create their stories with forest, animals, and everyday ecologies. Using mobile technologies and augmented reality, children can layer images, narratives, and at times sounds into physical places. These digital layers don't replace the material world, I would like to argue, but actually they reanimate it. They help children sense and story their environments differently and otherwise. To hear the forest as speaking, to imagine the view of an insect or the rhythm of the tree, to attune to lives that are oftentimes overlooked or not seen or heard. I have come to see through my research that augmented storying or storytelling more broadly can expand empathy, not by representing others, but by relating with them. Augmented storying in my research has shown to invite an affective and ethical responsiveness, a willingness to listen, to care, and to be changed through such encounters. In this sense, digital storying becomes a relational practice of more than human empathy, a way of engaging with the world that is imaginative, embodied, and co-created. I feel that my work resonates very strongly with the overall themes that this session and beyond propose: awareness, betterment, and care. For me, awareness invites noticing not only other humans, but non-human lives equally, of the technologies and histories that shape our stories. Betterment, on the other hand, involves striving for conditions where diverse beings can flourish. And care reminds us that storytelling is never neutral. It's moral, and in my case, I'm very interested, it's an ecological act. Digital technologies, when used intentionally, can help us slow down, to notice connections and interdependencies, to imagine the world otherwise. Yet they can also distract and commodify. Our task is to use these tools to amplify empathy and nurture attentiveness rather than to fragment it. And this requires pedagogical wisdom and sensitivity. So when I think about cultivating empathy through digital storytelling, I see it as a practice of reweaving the digital with the ecological, the affective with the cognitive, the human with the more than human. Digital storytelling is about creating story worlds where actually imagination can and should become a mode of care. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kupunainen. At this point, we would like to invite you, Dr. Siobhan Wittig-McPhee, to share your perspectives with us. We now welcome your remarks.
I think I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's really nice to, I know some of the other panelists, but it's nice to be a part of something where there's an appreciation for storytelling, but specifically for the educational and the pedagogical. So yeah, my name is Siobhan Wittig-McPhee. I'm an associate professor of teaching in the Department of Geography in Vancouver, UBC Vancouver. I really want to talk about, even though I just said about the education and pedagogical, how for me, it's not just a pedagogical tool, it's actually a fundamental way that I practice geography and really have myself and my students and my child and people around me think about our individual roles in, Christina mentioned ecological, in social justice. It's such a powerful way when we actually can embody some of these, and I'll speak to that a bit more in a moment. So my work bridges the scholarship of teaching and learning and geographical research. And it's really framed by a passion for experiential learning and engagement. And this is where I come from a background in cultures and places I lived of storytelling, but how I brought it into my Salto work is really through this very fundamental piece in geography, which is experiential learning and engagement. Or traditionally, you could think about it as fieldwork in the discipline of geography. Experiential learning is diverse means of creating and circulating knowledge for and with our students, our communities. And experiential learning is, it enables students to see personal narratives and contexts outside the physical classrooms as part of their education. So I'm an urban geographer by training. In economic geography, actually, so labor market inequality is what my graduate research was on. So thinking about how we move through cities or urban communities, and actually our participation in those communities is really key to what I'm hoping to articulate to my student. So the lens of storytelling, specifically using immersive media, and currently I really think about, for the last 12 years or so, this has been immersive audio. So actually the very neglected sense of listening that we have. A story fundamentally draws attention to the relationship between a personal experience and the broader context in which it's embedded. So my students, the listeners, it allows them, my aim is for them to see themselves in these spaces and places and in the lives of others. So storytelling is a primary form by which human experience is made meaningful at the essence of it. It has transformative possibilities, which are mediated in place. So being a geographer, it reinvigorates relationships with place, bringing people together through these shared experiences. And given what I just mentioned, my background, my hope is also to make the invisible visible, especially in low-skilled service sector work. Often individual people are invisible, even though they're very visible in the everyday impact and what they do. So spatial empathy is it's become, to me, really relevant. I've done a lot more work in it since the pandemic. Excuse me. Feel like I'm going to sneeze. So when we navigated away from physical spaces, there was a sense of like a disconnect. And so I started thinking a lot more how not just immersive storytelling, but also how what does it mean when people can actually articulate, my students in particular, what this connection with others is. So this concept of spatial empathy is something I've been exploring for the last 5 years. And this through a couple of projects, but one that I'll speak a little bit to now is on custodial staff on campus here in Vancouver. And so my aim was, again, this was developed as an experience for my students to become aware of others in the spaces that they move through, but also for faculty and staff more generally on campus. How can listening to the stories of custodial staff become a tool for social justice? And how can it make visible a lot of inequity in the staff that the staff experience, the custodial staff experience, and how actually our campus, like our UBC campus, our physical campus here, is an articulation of like the global nature of labor markets and as well. So we don't have to go very far to really look at the impact of what we have on the world. So I use, as I mentioned, 3D sound technology, and in the research that I've done, it has come out like the experience by students as a very powerful pedagogical approach. It does have a deep impact on their learning and the feeling of connection they have with places and also with people. And you may have come across it already, but in a moment I'll paste in the chat. The UBC Arts wrote a piece on the custodial staff, and also the UBC magazine. But the reason I'm sharing it is it gives you the opportunity, if you haven't already, to listen to the two pieces. Sorry, to the piece, you can read about them, but listen to the audio piece of the voices of these custodial staff. And I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wittig-McPhee. And now I would like to invite you, Dr. Maureen Kendrick, to share your perspectives with us. Welcome, Dr. Kendrick.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much to the facilitators for this invitation. The theme of this panel really got me thinking in many ways more deeply about the work that I've been doing in digital storytelling. and thinking about, the themes of empathy and care and justice that were deeply interwoven. But I think that the questions and the theme of this panel really got me looking back, rereading some of my work, and trying to surface those themes in new ways and make new connections. I think that, for me, some of the words that stand out in Christina's opening and in Shaban's opening, I'm thinking about how relational the digital storytelling was. And I'm going to be drawing a lot on a project that I did with a group of youth, all of whom had refugee experiences. And so that relational aspect, and really thinking about digital storytelling, not just as the product that the students created, but the deeply relational process between the students and the teacher, the researchers as part of that mix as well. And thinking about the word invisible, that this process of digital storytelling in my context really it kind of allowed students to track their lives, to sort of slow down the process, to become deeply reflective about where they had been, who they wanted to become. And we found that these kind of quieted identities that that many of these students hadn't been able to share or hadn't been able to talk about, and maybe that they had been rehearsing over and over very quietly, they began to surface, and there was sort of this emergence of confidence. Shaban used the word transformation, and so that the idea that that the storytelling was not prescriptive. It was this opportunity to kind of bring in their lived experiences, their identities, and to reclaim identities that maybe there hadn't been space for. And so I'm really thinking about digital storytelling in terms of empathy and care, as being about stories that deeply matter to students, and stories that have an audience. I think that often in school contexts in particular, students are asked to write stories or to create stories for an audience of one, often just for a teacher. But for the students in this project, there was a really expanded notion of audience, and so we found that they really had stories that mattered, stories that they wanted to tell, stories, as I said, about reclaiming. They had counter narratives. They had stories that were about deep civic engagement about issues that that really matter to them, and so that that notion of empathy and care was really woven into these stories, regardless of what their themes were. So maybe I'll leave it there for now, and just sort of end this opening with the idea that that it was much more about the tools and more about students being able to kind of track where they had been, and where they wanted to go.
Thank you, Dr. Kendrick. Now we would like to invite Dr. Kathleen Deering to the floor, and we would love to hear from you, Dr. Deering.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here, and I really appreciate the invitation to this event, which is really embedded outside my primary field of medicine and epidemiology. But it's really even just so far been an amazing opportunity for learning from others who also share passion for digital storytelling and arts-based work. So it's just a great opportunity to learn from others. So I'm actually trained as a quantitative epidemiologist and started my education career with a math degree. And I came to digital storytelling and arts-based research as part of the quantitative studies that I led. So we found that people really, while they enjoyed doing surveys for the most part, they really had so much more to share. So we would have open-ended questions where people would really have a hard time stopping talking about the stories that really affected them. And those are a lot of the pieces that couldn't come out in the quantitative work. And so we also do qualitative work too. But I think expanding to digital storytelling and arts-based work really allowed people to open up and have this really amazing venue to tell their stories. So I'll be talking about two studies that I have worked on with community. They're very different projects and have different teams, but there are some overlapping themes and experiences as well. I'll describe each briefly and share some reflections about them. I think we started these projects to have a communication pathway with health providers and share stories that patients couldn't, for various reasons, share with health providers themselves. So I'm sure we have all had experiences in healthcare where we feel like we don't have a lot of power. Like I had one last week, and I am a white, cisgender, middle-aged woman with the privilege of having quite a lot of education and working in this field, right? So a lot of resources. Both of the projects that I work on are with people living with HIV. One, it was with women and gender diverse people living with HIV, primarily based in the downtown east side. And one was a project with African Canadian immigrant people living with HIV. Again, women, men, and gender diverse folks. So as many people here are likely know, an HIV diagnosis happens at the intersection of a variety of social and structural inequities. Sorry, my cat's just joining me. She always likes to join Zoom meetings. So this can include criminalized substance use, sex work, power imbalances in relationships, poverty, food insecurity, trauma, and violence. And so people living with HIV can experience a variety of different intersecting stigmas and discriminations that shape their experiences in healthcare. Both of these projects took different methodologies and approaches and were created with community experts who were able to share these stories with health providers with the hopes of building empathy and stronger collaborative relationships to affect a change in practice. So we also all know that health providers have a ton of pressures, including particularly in the last 5 years, to providing, safe, supportive, inclusive care. Lots do, but there are still experiences that people have. And so these stories were really these very hopeful endeavor by people to share these stories that they couldn't, so that health providers could learn more about them and understand how some actions can result in disengagement from care and other barriers. So the first study that I will talk about is called My Story, My Way. And I'll put the link to both of these projects in the chat after I finish speaking. And so we have pretty much everything online now, I think, because people wanted to share them there. So the My Story, My Way project was the one based in the downtown east side, and the women in the study had experienced so much in their lives and in their healthcare experiences. So this project was very long, I think. And the reason for that was that everyone was involved in the development of the process and every research step along the way. So there was workshops and planning and research question development. And so it was really a research focused study. So we intended to create the stories as art and knowledge translation pieces, but also do research along the way. So we did follow-up qualitative interviews, collective sharing, dissemination, and knowledge exchange, and a community event in the downtown east side. The other project was a little bit outside of the standard digital storytelling approach, where we had a qualitative study, collected data over several years, and then we synthesized the stories into an animated video along with our community advisory team that took all of the stories that people had shared together and created one kind of synthesized narrative that the community came together and felt reflected the study as a whole. So I think both were intended to provide this venue to share these stories, to build empathy and stronger relationships. But I think in the end, we really were able to build community and empathy within the community as well. And so I think, in terms of intentionality, I think we can probably talk more about that in another point, but we came with our own kind of plan about what we wanted to do, and there was a lot of lessons learned and ways that we were able to be responsive to community needs along the way. So I'll just stop there and pop those studies into the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Deering, and thank you all for those thoughtful openings. I think there's a lot to unpack here, especially with the idea of intentionality. But something that I can highlight about these 4 openings is that the relational dimension of storytelling came afloat. And I don't know if you would like to start talking about the intentionality in the storytelling, what it means for your practice, and also how it relates to that relational dimension. I think that's an interesting topic that we could cover. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. Actually, this question was not that easy for me, and it was a provocation to think about what could intentional storytelling mean. Oftentimes, when we work with young children, everything is unexpected and beautiful and surprising, and intentionality perhaps rises in the moment. So it's not necessarily always so goal-oriented. But anyway, I was intrigued by the notion of intentional storytelling. And here is what I started to feel about this and think about the term. For me, intentional storytelling perhaps begins with attunement. It's about becoming and being aware of, in my case, relationships, materials, and histories that shape our story, and our story communicates to others and to ourselves. Who and what is being represented, and who and what might be left out. Are these intentional or not? Is a very important question to think about. In my own research, intentional storytelling has been inviting children and adults to notice intentionally, because it's kind of a pedagogical approach that has particular intentions. And in our case, we are hoping to investigate and discover how augmented storying helps children to notice the ecological and ethical dimensions of their relationalities with places and with ecologies, and perhaps also to learn about their own stories and learn from each other's stories, so that they can ask, what does this story do in the world? What impact does it have, and what consequences it has? And perhaps when thinking about storytelling in non-human ways, we could also think that in my case, for example, the forest may have a story, and it may be intentional story that it tells. So actually the storyteller is not only a human. I think, and beautifully, I think, Siobhan, in your work, looking at places, we know that many matters, bodies, create these stories, and they are not only human stories. And what's their intention and intentionality is actually a very intriguing and even a philosophical question. When we have been using augmented reality technology to entangle with storytelling, our intention is not only simply to employ technology creatively, but as I have shared earlier, to open a space for thinking about care and reflecting and co-presence, sensing the co-presence with other beings. So intentional digital storytelling actually could ideally become a practice of attunement and practice of responsibility, a way of participating in a shared world with awareness and respect. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can pick up there. I think intentionality, ultimately, storytelling is very relatable to I'm thinking of my students like 18 to 24, 25-year-olds. Christina's talking there about children. I have a 3-year-old. We really, like, if we think back to our 3-year-old selves, or if we have children, it's a very it is a very relatable way of seeing the world. I won't use the word understanding because that's maybe too big of a leap, but of seeing the world. And so I think for me, it's so much like back to what I was saying, and it's about experiential. It's ultimately about being an active inquirer, having whether it's my students or even myself, or it's like to ask questions. So the intentionality of using storytelling, I don't think I ever set out to use storytelling as a pedagogical tool and then to use digital storytelling. I think it was more my objective is, as I already said numerous times, experiential learning, but also just being ownership and having autonomy and having a part in your learning journey. And I think that to find a way that my students could actually relate to what the content or the skills that I'm trying to expose them to. And then the digital or the technology comes really because, try and use the tools that are around us in a way that, in a more critical way. So my students are not only using them as learning tools, but also questioning the technology and its role in their lives, not just as, passive social media, but something that actually can expose them to different experiences. So intentionality, I think, ultimately for me it was about using something that was relatable and not such a big jump for students in terms of seeing themselves in the stories of others or the experience of others.
Maybe I'll jump in here. Siobhan, you mentioned the word inquiry. In the project, in the research project that I'm drawing on, we spent a year with students in this kind of sheltered language program. All of the students in the class had refugee backgrounds. And I would say that the intentional storytelling, the digital storytelling, kind of came as a culminating project. We weren't planning for that. We were planning for different kinds of storytelling, but that just sort of where we had the work that we had been doing pedagogically sort of fit really well with digital storytelling. But throughout the years, students were really engaged in inquiring into different emotions. And so they were working with things like fear in their lives. They were working with things like safety, happiness, so a range of emotions that they were exploring through different modalities. They were using photography. They were creating portfolios with art and with music, and sort of thinking about how these pieces related to different emotions in their lives. And then as we sort of move through the school year with the students, we set up this digital storytelling project. So it sort of unfolded over several weeks. But the intentional part, I think, really came with students seeing examples of digital stories that others had created. And so, Siobhan was saying that digital stories, they have this relational element. They have this this way of drawing people in emotionally, drawing people in experientially. And the examples that we shared with the students really became, I would say, pivotal, that many of them really did kind of a turnabout in terms of where they were going with their storytelling, to suddenly say, I want to tell a story about my home country that is very different than what we're seeing in the media. I want to tell a story about an accomplishment of my own, to show people who I am in a different way. And so it was really, as I said in the opening, the intentional storytelling was about students finding stories that really mattered to them, and stories that they wanted to tell in a relatable, relational way to a broader audience.
Thank you so much for all of those reflections. And I think that I can lead off of that, some of those points you were making as well, Maureen, about autonomy and to some extent ownership over the stories that people tell. So I was thinking about intentionality a lot as well, and that potential tension between researchers and community, which is something I'm really aware of in the work that I do, and I'm sure everyone else here too, and just the need to be flexible and responsive, especially in something like digital storytelling, which is very personal, and people can be very vulnerable in sharing. And so we have this tension, right, especially in medicine, but in other fields as well, I'm sure. But just to develop research questions and get grant funding and publish quite a lot on what we're doing. And that's not always the goals of community, including in projects like this. So they want to get together and build community, produce art, have events, share food, and really genuinely try to improve something in their lives, like healthcare experiences. So when we went into the My Story, My Way project, we were building on a lot of previous work and community collaborations, and we wanted to develop the research questions to be really strength-based and trauma-informed in all aspects of the project. So the research questions we developed as a team were more around like, how did that positive experience in healthcare shape how you engaged in healthcare? How did you overcome barriers? And so really trying to focus on like strengths that people had and how that helped them, rather than focusing on deficits. So the surveys that we do typically have a lot of deficit focused questions. So have you experienced violence? Have you experienced barriers to healthcare? Did you experience stigma? And so people wanted to like shift that and go in a different direction. So that was where we started. But what ended up happening in the project, which was really interesting, is that the people who were doing stories didn't want to tell stories that way. What they wanted to do is tell these very difficult stories that were very challenging and personal, and then have people learn from those as well. So it was, and in the end, that was what we went with, right? Because that's what the stories that people wanted to tell. They didn't want to talk about strength. They wanted to talk about difficult experiences. So the stories that we ended up having, we have very long, content advisories at the beginning, because they are very difficult to hear. There's stories of trauma and substance use and pregnancy, houselessness, coerced abortion, violence. And so these stories are overwhelmingly about not being listened to, and how incredibly devastating that is, especially when people are often at their most vulnerable in the healthcare system. So those were the stories that we ended up with, and they're powerful and they're beautiful. We also spent quite a lot of time afterwards doing follow-up meetings and discussions and trying to really brainstorm practical and hopefully useful recommendations to healthcare services and providers afterwards, so that there could be the sort of ending on a strength-focused note. And so I think that works well, but it can be, if you're only listening to one single story, then you might not get the full understanding or experience. So, but in the end, we were able to collectively create those recommendations at the end, which I think were very helpful. But it was very different from what we expected and intended from the beginning.
Thank you. I think that one of the interesting points to highlight here is that you all didn't, I mean, your intention was not to resort to digital tools from the beginning, but as a result of the exploration of the process and the experiences that the participants wanted to share. So it's really nice to see that it was not the use of digital tools for the sake of using them, but with a purpose, and that it worked in your environment. So in that sense, how do you see them enhancing the of fostering empathy or care in the message they wanted to communicate, or hinder it? I mean, were there times where your participants said, this is too much, I don't want to work with digital tools or in this process because of the tools in themselves? Or you always saw it as something that it was enhancing the experience?
I think that's really interesting point. Like, I think that we all came to that, and that Christina, you just highlighted it. I think too often, digital particularly, but have become, it's like, oh, I want to do that. I want to create an augmented reality. I want to do this, and therefore, and we forget that, like, it's more about the like having it unfold, like what is the best way to present research or to present the experience of others. And so, just to put it into very like practical, like I try and bring guest speakers into some of my courses, right? And that is because I'm not an expert in many things. I know a lot about many things. I'm certainly not an expert in any one thing. And so, but even having one person, whether it's their profession or sharing the experience of their life, it's still one-dimensional, and so I think what I realized through using digital storytelling is I could expose my students to multiple perspectives, and they could then put themselves in the midst of that as well. To your second point of like, was there any concern with the use? I would say quite the opposite. I think, well, I would preface it by saying I think it's really important when you're especially working with vulnerable populations, when you're recording, because of digital storytelling, it's to really to work with them to understand, if they want to be anonymous, I'm using only voice, so that's quite straightforward. But just to make it like an iterative process, sharing drafts with them, so they hear their voice, they give you the final thumbs up. But what I found with the custodial staff, and then my more recent project with PIRS, which is working with immigrant women, it's an organization in Vancouver, that the recording allowed these women to really share their stories, but they didn't have to put themselves in front of a big audience. They didn't have to put themselves even in front of my classroom, which I think would have been intimidating for some of them. But many of them, he said to me at the end, oh, I forgot we were even recording, because it was like a conversation. So I think that's, like making sure it's the process is clear, but then also the nice thing that I found is that it enables it to be like a conversation, and ultimately that's what's nice about storytelling, that it should feel very like not performative. It should feel very fluid, so the opposite of performative.
I thought a lot about this question too, especially the hindered part. And I thought maybe I'd share a couple of stories about specific participants in our group. And so we had one participant in our group whose sister had experienced intimate partner violence. And the student in our study ended up telling the story about her sister. And I think in many ways, because her story was about standing up for women's rights and raising awareness about domestic violence, there was kind of a healing in telling the story, because she wasn't keeping that to herself anymore. She was able to share it in a way that other students understood, and there was a lot of empathy around that. She used pictures of her sister, and she shared the story with her sister. And so it was sort of the two of them almost telling this story together. But at the same time, there was also an incident where the digital storytelling, the process really kind of strained relationships between two girls. Both of the girls were from Afghanistan. One of the girls was from a minority group, and the student who was from the minority group really she was so engaged in the digital storytelling. She stayed up all night creating her story. She was using YouTube videos to figure out, how do I bring music in? How do I do different things? And then she mentored the other student from Afghanistan, not from a minority group. And she really tried to foster this relationship with her, and to, maybe develop empathy there through the process, and through mentoring this other girl. But what ended up happening is that a piece of music that Shagufa selected, Samira took that piece of music and used it in her own digital story. And so now they both had the same piece of music, but it was found by Shagufa. So it really kind of created a lot of tension between these two girls. And in the end, when we interviewed Shagufa, she said that, part of the process in creating the story caused her to lose trust in a friend. So that's an example of how it sort of hindered relationships.
Sorry, I lost connection. Can you hear me now? Yes, okay. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps I think this is a very important question, and if we go directly to thinking about the kind of challenges or concerns, particularly in my study, our study, we are working with young children. We are interested in their kind of awareness of ecological relations and ecological issues, and then integrating technology use into this work. I think this is a very contested area, young children, technology, and shouldn't be the environment be, one should connect with it without technology. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in my case, augmented storying, is to, as a researcher and scholar, to try to understand what it affords, what kind of opportunities it creates, and what are the challenges. I have already highlighted some of the opportunities that we have noticed, and I think you have also all beautifully illustrated how this offers opportunities for digital storytelling to really in multimodal ways share your experiences to others in ways that reflect your identity. And so I think also for young children, storytelling, if it's through talk or writing, can be very kind of demanding and not so pleasant process. But this multimodality that technology allows is very important and gives the space for alternative ways of being and expressing who you are and who you would like to be and what your histories are and so forth. And we have also noticed that one of the strengths in this kind of digital storying, which is also kind of digital documenting, it creates like a artifact also to be shared with others, and it becomes like a collective memory, personal memory, and then when you share it, a collective memory. And this kind of archiving is for many very important. So I can see the actual story making important. It can be very important process, not only the outcome. Sometimes you don't even want to share what you created in the end. It's just engaging in this kind of storytelling through technologies that allow us to kind of multimodal ways to express ourselves and document our feelings. But definitely there are these concerns, in my case, the technology and how it fits with these types of environmental education efforts, and with young children who are already, there are dangers of addiction and overuse. So how to balance that, that's very important. But one could also think in more post-digital ways, not only post-human, but seeing the technology as being entangled to the whole process. And pedagogically, we really need to think of this kind of relational and ethical design of storytelling activities, and trying to ensure that the activity is really meaningful, because you can also create and construct beautiful stories without digital technology.
Thanks so much for that, Christina. And that made me think a bit about how digital storytelling is increasingly being evaluated for its potential impact on mental health and positive mental health of people who are participating in the digital storytelling, and in some ways can be therapeutic. And we definitely found that in our studies too. People found that they just felt better in general, and they got a lot out of, in terms of self-esteem and feeling like they could advocate more for themselves after hearing so many stories of others, and really participating actively in that. So I think that's a really interesting area to explore too. And in terms of the digital tools helping or hindering, I think about that as, from a methodological standpoint too. I've worked on other art-based projects with community, including body mapping, and I didn't work directly on this, but I know the team has worked on photo voice before as well. And some of those projects are, some of those approaches to collecting these kind of arts-based data are closer to people, I think. So, they can come together and everyone can get felts and a big paper and draw on paper together, and, or take photos, get a camera, go back to their place, bring them back. And so those feel closer than digital storytelling did, where there was some photo gathering, of course, but it was really like the bulk of the work, as everyone knows, is like putting everything together and adding music and doing the voices and creating the stories themselves, right? So it felt like that might be something that people didn't connect with as much, but they really did. And I think they enjoyed learning something new. And even though I'd say most of the people in our studies don't have a ton of great access to technology and aren't as adept and experienced in using different forms of technology, I think ultimately, like, the benefit of creating these really accessible stories, like short, quick, 2-minute, maybe 3 minutes at most, stories that could be shared so easily, just really overcame any concerns that people have. And we were actually surprised how much people wanted to use AI as well. So being able to use an image generation program was really helpful and reduced barriers to people, because sometimes they didn't feel like they could go out in the community and take photos, or that would then, kind of disclose who they were depending on the photos they were taking. And so then they could kind of use their own creativity to create photos using something that was like a little bit further apart from them. And we did a sub-project on imagined futures with some of the team. And they came up with these amazing stories, like really like speculative fiction, kind of like sci-fi approaches to what they would envision their best healthcare experience as looking like. And that was really cool. And we wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail, but didn't have time. So I think, people really do connect with new technologies, and it can be really helpful in reaching people more effectively, efficiently, and still be really powerful. And one of our stories, and just one, was shared at a recent medical education event last week on HIV care with women. And so there's an audience of 30-ish or 30 or more physicians working with women living with HIV. And they, the presenter asked permission, took a story from the website and had a bit of an intro on it, because we provide as much information as we can online as well. And so that was fast and quick and easy, and people can incorporate it into their own work and education too. So I think yeah, there's lots of new opportunities and probably increased as we go too.
Thank you so very much. I know our next topic was going to be ethical questions, but I would like to continue with Kathleen's intervention. You were talking about participants having or not having knowledge and the love they had to use AI. And I wanted to continue on that idea because I do understand that there is a digital gap out there, not only in people accessing tools, but also in terms of the literacy. So in doing these projects, how do you ensure equity or access and justice as you innovate? Because sometimes we assume, okay, these are children, they learn easily, or people already know how to use digital tools, and sometimes that's not reality, right? So how do you ensure that in your projects?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I was thinking of that as Christina, Maureen, and Kathleen were speaking, that even in the land acknowledgement in the introduction, it was mentioned, the environment, ecological, and AI. And and as a geographer, there's a lot of, I get asked a lot now, because I do actually do work in like AI literacy, digital literacy, and this is a part of it, in like it's part of my scholarship of teaching and learning. And I was at a conference recently in Banff, of all places, and one of the audience members asked me about a particular tool that I'm creating. Well, how do you justify the environmental cost of AI and that? And that is, to me, is the essence of experiential, and hence the use of storytelling, digital storytelling for me. Yes, servers and AI have a big impact on the environment, but take a step back and look at your own daily life. Did you drive to work? Do you, how much do you fly? How many of us flew thousands of kilometers to get to that, a very expensive part of the world where it was 0 degrees Celsius and therefore heating was on constantly, to the point where so it's like we have to start by like taking a step back and not thinking about, okay, I can't control what's out there. If we start to control, or to change maybe what we do in a daily basis, then we will have a bigger impact. That's what I would maintain. And that's kind of a local, global dialectical relationship that we talk a lot about in geography. So to thinking about AI literacy, digital literacy, I think by using, when I use these tools, I hire undergraduate students to help me create them. But then and then my students obviously experience them in their classes as part of their assignments. And then in the upper year courses, I ask my students to then create artifacts as well, digital artifacts, whether they be wikis or digital stories. because ultimately it is about them being active learners, active inquirers, as we've already talked about, and taking ownership of that. And by doing that, they will develop the skills to critique the technology. That, as we've all, four of us have been saying, ultimately, it's not about whatever tool we're using or platform. It is about the methodology, as Kathleen said. It's about ultimately what is the objective, what is the best way to present this, or to have, in Christina's experience, like the best way to have kids engage. And I think my 18, 19-year-old students are the same. This is a way to really get them to engage, but also then to be critical of like the tools that they're using, and to think about the ethics of it. Oh, hang on, I want to use AI in creating my wiki, but what does that mean in terms of authorship and the ethics of that?
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone?
I
Okay,
can make
Catherine.
another. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch again on that issue of equity and some of the strategies we've used to make sure that everyone is able to engage in some of this work. So like I say, well, everyone has a phone now. I'm sure many of the community experts that I work with haven't had the opportunity to develop really extensive digital literacy skills. And so at the same time, those are often the people we want to engage the most. So what we've done, and it's a privilege to have the funding for this. So I've been lucky and, fortunate in terms of getting funding to put into community engaged work. And I have a lot of control over what I do with that funding. And so what we do is just take a step back and go really slow. So it might take a while, but it's important. We recognize that we need, it's a tail again. Every time I start talking, she just hops right on. It's like, so we put time, effort, and money into it. So we compensate people for every meeting they come to in a way that is really, like, I think reflective of the amount of time that they put into it. So we really make sure to do that. We have food, we make it a comfortable, safe, inclusive, confidential environment, and we take time with it. So all of my staff have had training, which is costly as well. So the 6-week training through the Story Center in the USA, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of as well. And so they all have they come with expertise, and many of the staff are also of lived experience as well. So they're able to connect with people. And then we book as many workshops as we need to in order to get everyone to the place that they need to be in order to engage. And so that's just critical if we want people to be able to do it. So we make it a nice, safe, fun, engaging environment where it's like a celebration and an event and people can come together, and then we make sure everyone has the skills, and we just take as long as we need. So some people need longer than others, and so we just make space and time for that. Otherwise we couldn't do it. Like, it just wouldn't be possible, and we would really end up working with only people who came in with really strong digital literacy skills, which is also valuable, right? Like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that work either. It's just, if your goal is to engage people who are really disengaged and excluded from a certain area for a variety of different social, structural inequities, then I feel like that's pretty important and almost necessary in some cases.
I'll add to that, just to say that for the students in my study, they really had to find their own pathway into the digital storytelling. The workshops that we had for students, we had a digital storytelling facilitator that we hired, and she was assisting. I had graduate students who are also supporting students. And I think that the initial way that the facilitator had kind of set out the steps in digital storytelling, where students might start with doing storyboarding and then they might move to something else. She sort of presented it as a linear process, but that wasn't what worked for students at all, and they abandoned that very quickly. they needed different access points. Some of them started with a piece of music. Some of them started with a photo that was part of their portfolio. So they really had all of these different entry points. And they needed that space, they needed that time. Some of them had a lot of skills. Others needed more mentorship and needed more scaffolding from either the research team, but also from classmates. So there was that kind of mentorship that was taking place with classmates as well. But it really, they had to find their own pathway. And so, I would just emphasize that trying to do something prescribed was, or prescriptive, step by step, what would never have worked in this context.
Thank you. So we already touched upon the idea of the ethical implication of using technology, for example, AI, in terms of environment. But have you come across with other ethical questions or challenges in producing this projects or researches?
I'll just say one of the barriers that I face, and I'd be curious to hear from the others, is, I mean, digital storytelling is what I have come to define as public scholarship. And in the academy, this is, especially in my department, which is very traditional, it's very difficult to have that regarded as scholarship. And I know here we're focusing on more on the pedagogical and experiential, but I think, sorry, and the teaching and learning, but that's key as well. So it's the ethics to me are like, say when I apply for a BREB, right, to do the research that with the women with PIRS, is articulating, because often the organization and the participants are very excited and they see this as a really empowering way of having their voice heard. And yet institutionally, it's still seen, well, we need them to sign a form and and that part is often where things, people become really nervous, like, if you like the more traditional approach to like writing things down, putting things down on paper, even though ultimately it's still an artifact you're creating. So it's just to the ethics, it's just interesting. I think we're in a time of like, out there beyond the walls of the university, people have been doing public scholarship and doing storytelling and different forms of media for a lot longer. And we're bringing it into education, to part of what we do in our research and with our students. And I feel like we haven't quite figured out what the ethics are. I think as researchers and educators, we have a duty to make sure that all our participants, whether they're our students or our non-student participants, are very become a part of a project, fully informed and consent, obviously, to their participation. But how we report that on a official BREB or grant or that, to me, is still it's a gray area at the moment. That maybe not answering your question specifically, but something I think about a lot.
In our research with younger age group children, we have tried to stay very open. There are situations when actually children want to become researchers and they want to video, not us researchers, but they want to just take the role of the researcher. So being flexible with the ways children want to engage in these activities. And we earlier talked about intentionality and like us researchers have certain intentions, but being open to change your plans and giving children the space to create their stories in ways that they want. And if they don't want to, that's fine too. So being responsive and very kind of open to change the plans. So co-creating the research is very important when you engage with young children. But funnily enough, I don't think I'm necessarily not answering this question, but it came to my mind that I'm currently writing a paper from our project, and this paper was not planned beforehand. It deals with children's ethical or moral imagination. Through their storytelling, actually, they started to engage in kind of thinking the ethics, how humans act, behave, and use forests and trees. And so we were identifying a lot of this, we call it moral imagination. So attending to the ethics, not as a researcher, but they are researchers in a way of their environments. So this was something beautiful and surprising, and now I'm working to understand better even what these stories and the storying activities allow us to learn more, and what this moral imagination was about. But definitely engaging in research with young children, there are many ethics involved, and I just like and emphasize this kind of a relational, respectful practice that even if we researchers have some plans, we need to be ready to accommodate and live in the moment with the children.
I think for many of us, when we hear the word ethics, we go to our experiences with our behavioral research ethics board and some of the complications around that when we're working with vulnerable populations. I would say that with my group, with the students with refugee experiences, that we really tried to think about ethics and consent as ongoing, and to have a lot of conversations around, you know, how the stories would be shared, and to share with them pieces of writing that we had done in relation to the project. But one thing that I wanted to highlight, some of the other people on the panel have mentioned the issue of anonymity. And one of the things that we put forward to the ethics board was that these students had a right to claim authorship of their stories. And so they had the right to not be anonymous. And for all of the students in our study, they wanted their names attached to their stories. They wanted their names to be included, their first names to be included in the papers that we wrote. And they couldn't consider otherwise, saying that, you know, use a pseudonym. Well, that, you know, they were very attached to those stories, and they wanted their names associated with the stories. That can sometimes be challenging to convince bread boards of.
Yeah, that's a great point too about making sure that people have their own ability to choose whether or not they want to share their stories publicly or not. I think my biggest concern with in terms of ethics and working with the folks that I work with is having those stories out there, and once they're out and on the internet, then it's hard to pull them back. And there's not a lot that we can do, including if people change their minds. HIV is still really stigmatized and in some cases criminalized. And I do worry that people's status can be inadvertently disclosed somehow, or they don't realize what the implications are. We put a lot of work into our consent process. We had multiple layers so that people could do the stories and never share them with a single person, to, you know, whether or not they wanted to do the stories, share at a conference, but not ever put it on the website. So people could choose, and they can also change too. So they can, if they change their minds and they don't want their story up anymore, or if they've changed any aspect of their consent, then of course we will honor that immediately and take it down and do what we can to remove it where we can. You know, we did other practices like changing voices, using AI, using digitally altered voices, having someone else read it out, read their stories out, just so that people could feel safer. In some cases, like, you know, I almost felt like I had to put more breaks on, and that comes to that tension about like how people want to be disclosed versus whether or not, you know, the anonymity piece is safer, and that sort of tension of paternalism, right? If I'm saying like, oh, I think it would be safer if you weren't really like disclosing this. But, you know, some people wanted to use like pictures of the healthcare service that they had experienced a negative healthcare experience at, which is difficult too, right? Because it is like making, you know, putting a lot of emphasis and pressure on one location and or one provider, and we didn't want to do that either. But really, in the end, you know, it's really about what people were most comfortable with. And then, you know, the other point about having this recognized as, you know, valuable academic scholarship. You know, I haven't successfully received a grant solely for digital storytelling yet. And being honest, we drew on some existing funds we had for the quantitative work to fund My Story, My Way, even though, you know, it's very well aligned with our KT goals. For Drive for Change, we also didn't intend to begin with to do an animated video, but we did do that in the end as well with those funds. And I think, again, it's still very well aligned. I think there's such a focus on meaningful knowledge translation and exchange in public health and medicine now. So not just doing research for research's sake, but making sure that our results get out there and do something as best as we can. That it's, I think digital storytelling is fairly well received, even though it's a newer approach in those spaces. And people are really grateful to not have to read like an infographic, which are also great. We do those too, but not to read like a report or a summary or another paper or have another kind of academic presentation where it's, you know, the same kind of format. You know, we do a lot of repetitive presentations, 10 minutes to synthesize, you know, an entire study kind of thing. And so people really value the increase in digital storytelling and arts-based research. And I think that that's true on like how, you know, I'm evaluated as a researcher and also in the broader research space. But grants, you know, I'm not sure yet. We'll see how that goes. I think it's still, we'll see how that changes and how much we have to sort of make the methodology more rigorous and the analysis of it more rigorous rather than, you know, not putting as many restrictions on the process, which I think is more valuable to some extent, but is not as well received in the grant sphere yet.
Thank you so very much. I would like to open the floor to see if any of the participants here have any questions. You could either raise your hand or write on the chat. Okay.
I can go ahead.
Okay.
Do you have my voice?
Yes.
I just wanted to say it was one of the best Viewpoint sessions I have ever attended. It's really, I myself am an immigrant woman, and I think like having people connect with each other through storytelling, considering that they are from different geographical locations. And honestly, based on your geographical locations, you might be denied many of the privileges and rights in the other parts of the world. So I thought it is very powerful that, for example, the stories told by girls in a country, for example, in the Middle East, is shared with girls who have been raised here. And this, this can give them a perspective. Yeah, so it's very powerful. And but also I was thinking about this aspect that, you know, in countries which are politically kind of closed, you don't have that freedom to really have people share their stories. And even if you have them share their stories, again, there's this aspect that you might, I mean, researchers might have limitations in sharing that information because, again, because of all those power dynamics and what will happen to them. So not all stories may be able to be shared. That was my point. And then one I mean, I really enjoyed all the conversations here. One question I had for Shiban was, I haven't really listened to the custodial staff podcast that you shared, but maybe two questions I have. One is for everyone, like those voice messages, like audio files. Did you ever try to like, recreate the voice file with AI voice rather than the authentic voice of the person? Because I mean, I myself as a person, I might be worried. Still, people might identify my voice, and especially if this is from a vulnerable, like someone with HIV, I don't know, custodial staff, so they might find it a little, maybe they might feel uncomfortable sharing their authentic voice. So have you ever considered that? Have you ever had a request like that? And then another question was for Shiban, like, how do you, I'm missing this part, how you exchange how do you work with your students? Like, I mean, do you give them an assignment about like these are the podcasts by the custodial staff? I just didn't get that part. Like, listen to these and reflect on that, or do you ask them to produce something themselves, or just that classroom thing that's happening in your geography lessons? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I can answer both questions first quickly. No, I wouldn't use AI right now for two reasons. It would require permission from the participants. And I'm not comfortable because I don't know where AI is at yet. In terms of protecting people's identity, there's already existing technology where someone's voice can be changed, but none of the participants I've worked with have asked for that thus far. So, and to your second question on how do I use these pieces in my classroom? Yes, they are built-in assignments into, depending on the level. I have various, I teach first, second, third, fourth year courses. So, and I have various artifacts. I don't use the word podcast because to me, podcast is a very different artifact. What I'm doing is not, it's storytelling because I am most definitely not trying to present a viewpoint. I'm trying to share experiences. And so, for example, in my first year courses, I simply have recorded sounds from around the city of Vancouver, and I asked my students if they can identify them and what helped them identify them. Was it the sound of the birds in Stanley Park? Was it the SkyTrain? Like these recognizable sounds. So again, just asking them to stop and listen. So that's in first year. With the custodial piece and some other projects, depending on the week, usually it's in a week where it's on inequality in the city. So we have like our usual the content and that, and then the assignment. They listen to it and they're asked to reflect the experience of listening and then to pick out the themes in the participants' stories that they can relate to, like urban inequality that they heard. And yeah, it's submitted as an assignment. When I've done any scholarship of teaching and learning research, which I have, that is totally voluntary. So that would be a second step where students are, there's incentives like a UBC gift card for the bookstore, but they're asked to volunteer. And then it's a grad student that I would work with where it's totally not linked to their assignment because that would be unethical. And they submit a survey based on the experience, and the grad student kind of compiles that data, and then we're able to write about how the students did they were they able to articulate what empathy was, spatial empathy, through listening to these stories? Did they feel connected with the participants? So more reflective. There's a quantitative piece to it as well, like a scale. But again, I don't see the individual answers to that. That, you know, is working with a grad student. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Maybe I'll quickly say something about the AI bit as well, Miriam, and thank you for your comments. The project that I'm drawing on primarily was taking place in around 2022, and AI wasn't as common then. But the students that we were working with, many of them didn't want to use voiceover because they're learning English and they didn't want this kind of fixed representation of how they were speaking English at the time. So a lot of them chose to put in captions rather than use voiceover. But in another project, one that I haven't talked about today, earlier this year, again working with adolescents, many adolescents have this kind of self-consciousness about hearing the sound of their own voice when it's recorded. And so for many of these students, they were asking if they could use AI to replace their voice. And so for reasons not of anonymity, but because they just don't want to hear their own voice recorded. So that is something that's emerging in a new project that I'm working on.
Thank you.
Thanks. And just to say, we did use digitally altered voices for some people who wanted to in our projects. But I don't think that we used AI per se. It was just a feature as part of the software that we were using where we could make that work. For the video we made with Drive for Change, we considered having people from the project if there was one person who wanted to be the voice of that project. But in the end, I think it was just safer for everyone. There was no one who wanted to be that one voice. And so we hired a voice actor, which was also, you know, took some thought and care as well. Because the team wanted it to sound like it could be someone in the study though too. So have some shared cultural and language background as the people in the study who are all people living in Canada who are from African countries and had immigrated here, most of them recently. So that we had to really be careful about who we chose and did, you know, it took a little bit of time and again, some funding, justifiably so, but I think it was worth it and everyone was happy with it in the end.
Thank you. It's very interesting that you have considered their cultural, geographical background, the voice actors. Thanks.
And thank you, Mariam, for your feedback and questions. They are very important. Perhaps I would like to address and continue with Kathleen's elaboration, and particularly when it comes to what might, or there is another question actually, not Miriam's, but Dorothy is asking here, what factors might contribute to storytelling getting less funds? And my answer to that question is that I think social sciences and humanities research is perhaps more open to storytelling as a methodology. There are other disciplines, particularly in science, that may not necessarily be so familiar with storytelling as a methodology. So you need to, as a researcher, then very powerfully explain and justify your use of kind of alternative methods. So it's very important that there is enough justification, what purpose and how that kind of a methodology or method like storytelling is being used. It's always when you propose something very novel to that field, there is a risk that it is not taken as positively. But definitely I would say you can and should use storytelling in any types of research, but you just need to be aware how to justify and explain its use. And I think, Kathleen, you mentioned earlier how to even, you are going to analyze or interpret that kind of research, or who is interpreting. So I think sometimes storytelling may be like a knowledge mobilization, but sometimes it can be part of the real research project, and you are kind of looking into the stories or the story making processes. But important question, and indeed there are different types of methods that may require even more justification, are a little bit more risky in terms of funding, receiving the funding. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I was just writing a longer response to that as well, and it touched on a lot of your points too. But I think I'll send it anyway, but I think it would depend on the grant agency that you're applying through. So I apply mostly through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. But I think this work would be better placed in SSHRC to some extent, but I haven't applied through SSHRC yet. So we'll see how that goes in upcoming competitions. I think CHR can be supportive of social sciences research for sure, and there's plenty of examples where social science research has been funded. But I think I think there's just more that maybe I need to do, or needs to be done in general, about how to analyze and rigorously analyze digital storytelling to make more of an argument that it's the strong methodological approach. So we do pair it with qualitative research. And so, it might be collective viewing, might be individual reflections, but still, I think that adds something to justify to, something like CHR to fund this work, and being really convinced that it will be evidence-based and provide really useful recommendations and outputs. Because I agree with you that I think it's viewed more like health promotion or knowledge translation or health education piece, but I think it's also really valuable as research too. But it also doesn't have to be really rigorously analyzed either, right? Like there's something to be said about having art for art's sake and that being valuable too. So it's just really making the argument about why it's beneficial both for people who are participating in the study as well as others. So it's just, sometimes it's just about making the argument and figuring out how that will resonate with reviewers.
Thank you. There is one question here in the chat. This person is curious if you ever feel the need to balance the representations of things authentically, that is to say, without overlaid interpretation, against any limitations of raw anecdotal data, such as bias or outright falsehoods. So as researchers, do you feel any need to identify biases that storytellers will have when sharing? That's a very good question.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that quickly too. These, for us, it's like people are telling stories about their interactions with health providers, and the health provider may have a very different interpretation of that interaction. There may have been no intentionality in terms of their behavior. There may have been a miscommunication, a misinterpretation. It could be language barriers. There's a lot going on in a health interaction, including if you're, depending on the situation, like an emergency room versus a health provider office. And so we are conscious about that, right? And so we try to I think I mentioned before, move people away from really being very disclosing about who they were interacting with, and trying to be more general and think about the story as being something that is, taking different experiences and putting them together sometimes. But some of the stories are not like that. They are very disclosing, and you can definitely tell what's going on. But I think, it's also learning experiences for everyone. And I haven't really found that in talking to health providers who we work with or others, people are like, yeah, I have to, I'm always looking for ways to learn and improve my care too. And I think it's just about being humble and, being able to take that kind of feedback. But I think just trying to be a bit more, those are still people's real experiences, right? Whether or not it was an intended experience by someone else, or if there's a different interpretation of that story, that's still their real experiences, and I think can be are still really valuable and should be shared too. So I guess I don't feel like I don't feel like I have to, even though it's like I can identify biases or potential, like, situations where there might have been miscommunications. I feel like that's still their story and it affected them and that's how they feel. And so I'm happy to really support that. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. For the year that we spent working with these students, the classroom teacher did a tremendous amount of work around students' perspectives and potential biases about different political issues, different local issues, global issues. She had a practice, very mindful practice when the students would come into the class to talk about check-ins, what had happened for them. So they had always had these ongoing dialogues about what was happening, how to think about it from multiple perspectives. So there was a lot of work going on around how students thought they were perceived by others in the school, how students were perceiving others. So those kinds of potential biases. But I agree with Kathleen that, in the end, students were telling stories that mattered to them. Those stories may be infused with biases about their own country or about their own experience or about issues that might relate to how people should be treated or should not be treated. And so the digital stories were really about their lived experience. And I think that sometimes they are that lived experience. It's a result of how someone has been treated. It's a result of many things, and it can have bias. And students were open about that. They talked with each other. They talked with facilitators about the story they were trying to tell and why they were trying to tell it and why it mattered.
Thank you so much. I wanted to finish with my closing remarks, but I think I'm going to end up with Allison's remarks because they were beautifully written. She's saying that from the insights shared by all the speakers, the key takeaway for her is that digital storytelling goes beyond just a tool for multimodal expression. It is more about building relational connections with the storytellers, their listeners, and the co-storytellers, the people involved, and the environments around them. It is inspiring to see digital storytelling as a relational pedagogy of noticing, listening, and understanding, while also fostering an equitable and inclusive space for all voices in their lived or living experiences. Additionally, it serves as an emotional process for healing, documenting feeling, as well as curating and creating artifacts that reflect both personal and collective memories. Thank you all for the wonderful speakers for sharing such an insightful and thoughtful perspective. I think Allison's remarks really capture and enclose this presentation that is beautiful. I think one key takeaway that I was not expecting today is not only storytelling working for the betterment and care of community and people and education, but also the idea of using it for public scholarship to share this knowledge beyond the institutional repertoire and going to the public. I think this is an important key takeaway, and I think that research needs to go further in that sense. So thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you all for coming.